Gerald Groenewald is a University of Johannesburg-based historian. Since 2024, he has been affiliated to its Department of Languages, Cultural Studies, and Applied Linguistics. His research has focused on the development of Cape colonial society from the mid-17th to the early 19th centuries, including histories of criminal justice, gender, and family issues, and the development of Afrikaans, all themes that are foundational to the making of modern South Africa. He will be speaking to us today about the development of the Dutch East India Company during that period. So, Gerald, you truly are a chameleon in terms of your background and the breadth of your research. Can you please tell us about your background and your interest in Cape history?
Yes, thank you, Lindie, and thank you, Thula, for the opportunity. I have an unusual career, but it all revolves really around the early Cape and particularly the Dutch language. So I was originally trained, I did study history as an undergrad, but my early postgrad career was actually in historical linguistics. And I worked particularly on the origins of Afrikaans in the 17th and 18th century, notably the role that the Khoi and the slave populations played in that process. And then it was a bit of a, serendipity, but I was then asked to join a huge research project on Cape Town in the 18th century. And that was because of my ability to read Dutch very well. And that's how my career as a Cape historian started. So that was like, how long is it ago? 25 years almost ago. And so for most of my career, I actually taught history, and I did a lot of research on various aspects, as you mentioned, on the early Cape. But more recently, I've returned to my earlier interest in the history of Afrikaans, and that's how I ended up now being back in a language department. But I still continue my historical research, but I also have this other interest now in the history of Afrikaans and Afrikaans in general.
And of course, your timing is excellent because the history of Afrikaans is currently a very hot topic and
Yes.
debated throughout the community.
That is so.
Well, let's speak about the colonial foundation of Cape society. And I think a good place to start is with the Dutch East India Company. When is it founded, and where does the Cape fall into its history?
Yes, okay. So the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC as it was called then, and it's still called in Dutch historiography, was founded in 1602 in the context of competition between various colonial powers in Europe to dominate the spice trade with the Indian Ocean world, particularly what is now called South and Southeast Asia, Indonesia, India, and those areas. And at the same time, for instance, 2 years before this, 1600, the English founded their English East India Company, which particularly focused on India, but also later on, as we'll see, started to challenge the Dutch in that world. And of course, before them, the Portuguese were really the pioneers of trade with the Indian Ocean world. They already started in the late 15th century, but particularly in the course of the 16th century, when the Portuguese Empire rapidly conquered large parts of maritime Asia. So it was in that context that the Dutch founded the East India Company. It actually has a bit of a complicated history because they were so-called pre-companies, which were a variety of smaller companies which would each outfit a ship and send it to the east to trade and bring back spices, which were extremely valuable at this time. But it was very capital intensive. And the huge problem during this era, with all the wars between Spain and England and the Dutch and various other powers, is that often you would have privateering, basically pirate ships, which would attack these valuable ships. And it's for this reason that these various small companies asked the Dutch state, which was very new at this point. Dutch only sort of became independent in the late 16th century from Spanish rule. And they asked the Dutch state to allow them to organize a bigger company, which would have some rights that a state would have, such as the right to declare war and to make treaties and to do diplomacy and to administer justice in their colonies. And so that's when the Dutch East India Company was founded, and it very quickly became a rival power to the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean world. It conquered large parts of what is now called Indonesia, which was then called the Dutch East Indies, also had a foothold in India, in what was then called Formosa, which is now Taiwan. They ruled parts of the southern part of Taiwan, and also a bit later in the 17th century, they also conquered Ceylon, Sri Lanka, from the Portuguese. So during that period, all ships from Western Europe had to sail around the Cape of Good Hope. The Suez Canal was only built much, much later. So it was a long journey. These were sailing ships made of wood, and it could take up to a year to reach Batavia, which the Dutch founded on the island of Java, which was sort of the capital of the Dutch Empire in the Indian Ocean world. And it took a very long time, and because of the primitive nature of technology at the time, somewhere along the road, the ships had to stop to take in water. And that would be more or less somewhere in the southern African South Atlantic region. And for the first half or so of the 17th century, both the East India Company of England and the Dutch one would stop at various places, often St. Helena or St. Helena, sometimes the Cape of Good Hope, also sometimes Mauritius. And, the reason why they didn't originally always stopped at the Cape is because when the Portuguese first rounded the Cape, they had skirmishes with the local Khoisan population, and there was this belief that the Khoisan population were very warlike and would challenge anybody who come to their territory. So that's why at first they were kind of unwilling to call it the Cape. But in the course of the first half of the 17th century, people realized, but this is actually not the case. The Khoisan were very keen to trade with visitors on the coast, and they would trade their cattle. The Khoisan were pastoralists, so they had lots of cattle and sheep. And that's how both the English and the Dutch started calling more and more regularly in Table Bay, also sometimes Saldanha Bay, which is a bit to the north. And that's eventually how, by the mid-17th century, the VOC decided that it would be most advantageous for them to actually build a small, and this was set in the founding document, a fort and a garden in Table Bay. There was never the idea that it would become a colony. This whole idea of colonization, as we understand it today, is a later concept. You had colonial settler states in the Americas, in North and South America, but in this period, the 17th and 18th century, you didn't really have settler colonies in the Indian Ocean world and in Africa in the way it would later develop in the 19th century. So originally the idea was just that it would be what the historian Dan Slay called a maritime service station. So it's both for ships to take in fresh water, to get meat, which they would trade from the Khoisan, and also to, because this is why they needed to build a garden, to get fruit and vegetables and stuff like that, but also, most importantly, to service the ships, because, as I said, it's a very long journey, and, these are sailing ships built out of wood and rope and sail and stuff like that, and those things needed to be repaired. So that's why they decided to outlay this station, and it was also to kind of be, to show the English, we are kind of in charge in this part of the world because of the competition between these two. And from that period, the English started, they would sometimes stop at the Cape. And of course, all other nations also stopped at the Cape, and they had to pay for these services. But increasingly, the English started to stop at St. Helena on the island there. So that's why the Cape was, the little outpost was founded. It was originally called the Cape of Good Hope, or sometimes the Cape Spot, the Kaapse Vlek. It was just a tiny little place.
Well, so two questions come to mind straight away as I listen to this description. On the one hand, I can't help but drawing parallels between then and now, the idea of what happens when corporations take on the character of states. Mm-hmm. And that's how so much of colonialism in Africa actually took place, through chartered companies later, which always seems to be somewhat less regulated. So I would be interested in just thinking of those parallels, but then at the same time also, as you say, this outpost or service station, I like the idea of a marine service station as being established. And yet in our historiography, it's almost as if that pre-interactory period is missing. Mm-hmm. In traditional historiography, the nationalist version, it all starts with Van Riebeeck, so up to the point where Jacob Zuma famously said that's where all our problems began.
Yes.
And yet we have, neglected the interactions that preceded that. So I would like to know a bit more about that. And then also, why was Van Riebeeck commissioned to establish the resupply, and why him? And what were the key features of his administration?
Okay, so that's quite a mouthful. So yes, you're quite right. This earlier period has often been ignored. The history of white South Africa was always presented as this founding moment in 1652. Nothing happened before it, and the long and the short is basically this: is that the founding of this maritime service station at the Cape was the result of half a century of developments. So, as I said, originally in the 16th century, the 1500s, the Khoi had this reputation as being fierce, and that's why the Portuguese increasingly stopped not on the west coast, but on the east coast, what is now Maputo, Mozambique, and that's why it eventually, much later on, became a Portuguese colony. But the Dutch and the English both found, and we have lots of evidence for this, because all ships had to keep a log, a diary basically. So we have, and there's a wonderful collection which collects all of these things where they talk about the Cape before 1652. So they found, as I said, that the Khoi were willing to trade their cattle and sheep for especially copper and brass, which they used for their weapons. It was also convenient, because of the fact that the Table Bay is a very good harbor. It is deep. It is, although the Cape has terrible winds, it's sheltered, this Table Bay. And so for these reasons, it increasingly seemed like a good spot to start to do something more permanent. As I said, at this period also Saldanha Bay was often kind of in competition with the Table Bay, because it also has a very safe harbor. The reason why specifically Van Riebeeck and specifically the 1650 more or less became sort of the founding moment is that in the late 1640s, a ship on its way back from the East Indies to the Netherlands, the Haarlem so-called, stranded in Table Bay, and it had a very, very valuable load of spices, particularly pepper, which was immensely valuable in this period. And as is typical of this trading company, they wouldn't just let it go. So they left. And what was also typical in this period is that ships didn't go singly. They traveled in groups. A fleet, you called it a fleet. Like 5 to 10 ships or so. And so they first tried to save as much as possible of the valuable freight, and put it on the other ships. And the other ships had left for the Netherlands, but they left some crew members behind to take care of all the other parts, because this is the amazing thing about a VOC. Everything was valuable. Even the rope on the ship, if they could save it, they would save it. The wood, everything, all the bits of iron that it was, all the nails of that were used. Would all, if they could salvage it, they would salvage it. And so a few people remained, and they built, a little fort or something. There was recently a archaeologist who claimed to have found this spot. It's more or less where Tableview is now. It is, it is a bit controversial whether he's correct or not. But at any rate, and they stayed here for about 6 months, or a bit longer actually, and they had increasingly good relations with the Khoi, and they left they wrote also a diary, and when they came back, as was also typical for the VOC, they had to write a long report. And in this report, they actually then recommended that the Table Bay would make a really good place for a halfway station, as it used to be called. And I also particularly stressed the reason for this is that the Khoi were friendly and they were willing to trade. And also then, of course, the water and so on and so forth. And where Van Riebeeck comes in, this is a really intriguing story. Van Riebeeck was a young man at this point, about 30 years old, and he started his career in the East Indies, and for a while he was posted in what is now Vietnam, where the VOC also had a trading post, and he came back under a cloud of suspicion of having committed fraud. And he was recalled, and he had to go and defend himself in the Netherlands. He was found not guilty in the end. But the thing about Van Riebeeck, he's a true entrepreneur, and that if he saw an opportunity, he would take it. And so he was part of this fleet that picked up the survivors from the Harlem wreck. And when he came back, he also wrote a report to the directors of the VOC, and he made it very clear that he would be a perfect person to found this space, because remember, we are talking about a very tiny outpost of about 100 to 150 people. So his rank was not governor, he was a commander, and for this reason he recommended himself. And because of his past service and because he had such wonderful ideas, the VOC thought, okay, well, they'll give him this position. As I say, he was a very clever entrepreneur, and he was kind of in the deep water, and he had to clear his name, and he thought, he would kind of be also a sacrificial lamb. He's prepared to take on this difficult task for the company.
So far, we have centered 1652, and we've painted a picture of win-win cooperation between the global north and the global south, and yet everybody remembers 1652 as the birth of colonialism and slavery. Where does that fit in, and is that not ever a part of Van Riebeeck's administration? Mm-hmm. And if so, when does settler colonialism and when does slavery actually enter the story?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Once again, that's a myth from the old historiography. Like from the start, it was like the settler colony, and it has like everything. It's a process that takes about 50 years before we reach what you just mentioned, like a slave colony with a settler population. So Van Riebeeck, he was here for 10 years, and the bulk of his activities revolved around two things: keeping peace with the Khoi, making sure that he would trade enough cattle to provide all these ships with meat. Remember, as I said, a fleet has a large number of ships, and they have hundreds of crew on them. So we're not talking about one or two cattle at a time. It's dozens and dozens. So that was the one thing. The other one was coping with the terrible weather at the Cape. The early modern period, especially the 17th century, was sometimes called the Little Ice Age. Temperatures were much lower then than they were now. And so actually in Van Riebeeck's first year, it snowed on Table Mountain. And so they really had to battle the temperaments, the weather. And he had to build a fort, which was originally made out of soil and wood. It was not the castle that we now know. The castle was started in the 1660s, late 1660s, early 1670s. It took a long time to complete. So he really struggled, and the relationships with the local Khoi deteriorated because of this immense need for more and more produce. Also, one needs to understand the nature of Khoi society, in that the Khoi were not farmers. They were not agriculturalists. They were pastoralists who practiced transhumance. So at certain parts of the year, they would be in a certain place for a few months, and their cattle would eat would graze, and then after a few months, and as the season changed, they would move to different parts. And the Dutch didn't understand this, nor did they understand the fact that the Khoi didn't have like an overarching structure of, like they had a huge ruler or something. You had smaller groups which sometimes had a bigger overleader, which they would pay obeisance to, but it was mostly small groups with their own captain, as the Dutch called him, their own leader, and they would move around, and there were these complicated relationships between different parts of them. And most importantly, in the region of Table Bay, there wasn't a big group of Khoisan. The ones that were there were actually kind of outcasts who were very poor. They didn't really have their own cattle, but they very quickly started to become mediators between the Dutch and the other Khoisan groups. So these tensions resulted in the so-called First Khoisan-Dutch War of 1659, and it was resolved, and the Dutch increasingly started to trade with the Khoisan who were further to the north in Saldanha Bay. Van Riebeeck leaves in 1662, and what is a little known fact is that this was also a period of international conflict between the Dutch and the English, and the cost of keeping up the Cape Post increased enormously. And actually, at one point in the 1660s, the Dutch East India Company considered closing down the maritime service station. They thought it was just too expensive. One of the reasons for this is that one of the things, as I said, Van Riebeeck was this entrepreneur, and he constantly tried, because he struggled so much and there were so many failures, he constantly tried to come up with new ideas and new ways of making money. You know, as I said, if he saw an opportunity, he would grasp it. And one of the things he then suggested in 1657, 5 years after he came to the Cape, is to suggest to the VOC that some of the men that came out with him, and they were mostly men, they were like only a handful of women, that they be freed from the service of the VOC. So the people who came with him were all employees of the company, and they would all work for him. Some were soldiers, some were sailors, some were, artisans and so on, and they would all help to, service this station that they built. And he then realized that there's very good soil around Table Mountain, especially in what is now the southern suburbs of Cape Town. And he then wrote to the VOC, but a good idea would be for us if we free these employees, and then that's where the notion of a free burger comes from, a free citizen, and that the company would give them some implements and so on, and they would give them small farms, and that they would actually then produce fruit and vegetables for the ships, and they would sell everything to the company. But the problem was that these people all came from Holland, from the Netherlands, and they had very different experiences of farming there. So in Netherlands, you have what is called intensive farming. So you farm on a small piece of land with a variety of things, and that's not really what the Cape was good for. And so increasingly in the 1660s, many of these freeburgers failed in their farming endeavors, and they all moved to the Cape, back to Cape Town, and many of them started taverns and inns and so on. And for these reasons, the VOC increasingly felt, but it's not going to work. Things started to change, and that's where, to come back to your question, Thula, about where does settler colonialism start. Things started to change in 1679, when the company and a part of the problem was also is that after Van Riebeeck, you had a whole series of commanders and governors who served very short periods, like 2 or 3 or 4 years, and so they could never really, change things for the better. In 1679, they appointed Simon van der Stel, who actually was coincidentally born in Mauritius, which was also at that time a small outpost of the VOC, and he then served, and first he was commander, but he was later promoted to governor for 20 years. And it was under his leadership that he realized that the problem with farming at the Cape is this intensive farming. We should replace it what they call extensive farming. It should focus on specific products like grain and like wine. And he also, it was under his leadership that the colony started to spread inland, first into what is now called the Helderberg region, Somerset West, and then into Stellenbosch, which is named after Van der Stel, which was founded in this period. and also a bit more further to the north, places like Paarl and Wellington and those areas. And that is really the foundation of the settler colony, because from that point in the late 1600s, the colony started spreading because people could make enough money, they had lots of children, and that's how the colony in the first a couple of decades of the 1700s, it would spread further north until it hit like Namakwaland. It was a bit too dry, and then they started moving along the south coast further east and east. Come back to slavery. Once again, it is linked to the idea of releasing some company employees to become freeburgers. Van Riebeeck realized, because one of the things he constantly complained about is about how lazy, as he said, the Khoi were. He couldn't convince them to do agriculture, because as I mentioned before, these were pastoralists. They were not agriculturalists. They didn't understand the notion of, working on the land. And because Van Riebeeck had experience in the East Indies, where slavery was part and parcel of daily life, even before Europeans arrived there, you had indigenous forms of slavery. So he then also suggested to the company to import some slaves from elsewhere in the colonial world, and in 1658 the first two ships came from, actually coincidentally, the first two ships came from West Africa, and it was actually the only time in the history of slavery at the Cape that you had African slaves from the Atlantic world that came to the Cape, and they were sold to the freeburgers, and actually the bulk of them were sent on to the east because they didn't need so many, and that then started the development of the Cape as a slave colony. And particularly once Van der Stel started to expand the colony, have a rapid increase in farming, that then also increased the need for more and more labor, and that is also then why the Cape started to import slaves much more regularly. And in fact, the VOC in the second half of the 17th century increasingly actually sent expeditions to Madagascar to bring slaves to the Cape. The reason they went to Madagascar is because Madagascar was a sort of slave entrepot, where various groups from East Africa and other parts of the Indian Ocean world would go to trade slaves with European powers.
So to follow on what you explained to us, I think it is one of those slavery is one of the turning points in South African history. And it's in Herman Gilloomier and Richard Elphick's book, The Shaping of South African Society, where they regard it as the major turning point. And the way in which they describe it, if I could recall correctly, is this fateful decision of the need for more labor. Shall we import Dutch laborers or shall we import slaves? And in the decision to import slaves, you then see the rise of the racial hierarchy and the labor aristocracy. What is your take on that interpretation?
Yes, this is a well-known distinction in the VOC historiography of the early Cape, in that this decision that you're talking about happened in 1717. The then governor and the Council of Policy, which kind of ruled the Cape, drew up a report on the conditions, especially economic conditions at the Cape. And in that report, they suggested to the VOC that they shouldn't try and import laborers from Europe, but they should rather continue with slavery. By that stage already, the colonial population, in which I do not include the Khoi at this point, because the Khoi were never enumerated, so we never know exactly how many of them were around. But they were already by 1717 about equal numbers of slaves to colonists, including the people who worked for the VOC. Because remember, the European population had two parts. You had the VOC employees, because the VOC, when they built the castle, they also had a garrison there, and at various points in the history of the Cape, this garrison would be expanded, but there were always at least 500 or so soldiers, plus all the administrators and all the artisans and people who worked for the VOC. But the bulk of the population, even by the early 17th century, like 80% of them would be freeburgers who lived on farms and made money out of mostly out of farming, but although there were also some who were traders and entrepreneurs and so on in Cape Town, the little town. But to come back to your question about this fateful decision, that indeed is the reason why historians of the early Cape would sometimes divide this 150-year history into two halves. Just like you have, we will probably talk a bit about it later on, the notion of an open and a closed frontier. So the early Cape society, until about the 1710s, the first 60 to 70 years, you had a much more open society in which race was not a huge division. In fact, there was a great deal of marriage between Europeans and freed slave women. Because remember, I said at the start that the VOC at first only sent basically males. There were attempts to encourage women to migrate to the Cape, but it wasn't very successful. And so there was a fair amount of intermarriage between slave women or freed slave women and European colonists. And, they were people of color who, could reach, positions of wealth, and who even owned their own slaves. Some slaves were freed, especially during Van der Stel. He had this experiment where he thought he could populate parts of Stellenbosch district with freed slaves. The experiment failed, but and most of the freed slaves moved to Cape Town, and that's why there was always a large part of Cape Town contained so-called free blacks, which is what they called freed slaves at the time. So after 1710s, when the number of slaves increased, you increasingly find that race relations became more rigid. But once again, it wasn't a sudden change. It took like 50 years. By the 1770s, 1780s, there were clear signs that people had a racial identity and that people of color were kind of looked down upon. In this period, the 1770s, 1780s, you had a separate corps of soldiers who were of color versus the white militia, and so on and so forth. I've done work on children born out of wedlock during this period, and when they had a colored mother, they were treated differently by the church than white children. But this is the development that takes like half a century, from about the 1710s, 20s to the late 18th century. But certainly the general point is true, that I think it is true that the fact that you have a division between an aristocracy of landowners who have people of color doing the menial work would influence future perceptions of race and what is the position of white people in the country. And I think that those ideas, it is a bit controversial. Rob Schall first suggested it, but that those ideas were kind of taken into the interior of South Africa by the fur trackers in the 1830s. And actually, it's a part of the historiography that needs much more careful research than has been done. We understand the situation in the 18th century much better, but how those ideas filtered through in the course of the 19th century to different parts of South Africa, I don't think is well understood yet.
And then just another question on the nature of slavery. Because what struck me recently when reading about slavery in Africa, and then thinking of the Atlantic slave trade, and then the East African slave trade, or the Indian Ocean trade, and even across the Sahara, Cape Town was constantly singled out as the exception, and the reason why, because eventually the slave population outnumbered the settler population, which then gave it a particularly brutal character. Do you also concur with that idea?
To an extent, I have to say it is true that the slave population outnumbered the number of settlers or colonists, but never by much. I have done various work on the statistics of this, and at most it was about 10% more. So it is a striking feature that it is more or less equal. So yeah, I don't know it's so hard to compare different areas to each other. But I don't know that Cape slavery, by no means it was mild, as people used to think and to claim in the past. It was, of course, a system based on violence, but I don't know that it was more brutal than elsewhere in Africa. The striking thing about slavery in the early Cape, which makes it so different from the much more better known transatlantic slave trade and the Atlantic colonies, is that you never had huge slave plantations. So the interesting thing is that slaves were spread more or less equally across farms in the southwestern Cape. But the further you went into the interior, the fewer and fewer slaves you had, because what happened with colonists who moved to the interior, as it became drier, they would become pastoralists. They would rather farm with cattle and sheep than actually plant wheat or something like that. So the bulk of slaves, the majority of slaves, were concentrated in the southwestern Cape, but you rarely had any person owing more than maybe 10. A lot of work has been done on the statistics of this. Most farmers had 5 to 10 slaves. So the interesting thing, and this goes back to my interest in language, is that on any given farm, you had this interesting little microcosmos. You had a European family with their children, maybe with one European knecht, as they were called, like a servant, but they often became the equivalent of a farm manager, and then maybe 5 to 10 slaves, and maybe a couple of khoi who helped them with taking care of the cattle. So, and that is in these small communities of 10 to 20 people who come from different parts of the world, but they all had to use some form of Dutch to communicate with each other. And for me, that is the origin of Afrikaans. It's in those small communities. So the interesting thing is that there were no large collections of slaves, except for one major distinction, and those were the slaves that belonged to the VOC, who the majority of whom worked in Cape Town, particularly but on the one hand in the garden, what is now called the company's gardens in Cape Town were indeed gardens with fruit trees and vegetables. It was also a very big one in Rondebosch. But so many of the slaves worked there that belonged to the VOC, but as many worked in the harbor. Once again, an aspect that people forget about. They always think, this is this colony full of farmers, but actually the Cape Town always looked across the oceans, because that's where the money came from, is all these passing ships. So the one exception to the idea of small slave holdings is the VOC's own ownership of several hundred slaves who lived in what was called the Slave Lodge, and which is now, of course, the Slave Lodge Museum, which still exists in Cape Town. And that was, Rob Shull has done a lot of work on the Slave Lodge, and it could be very tough in that place. Yeah.
Let's can we speak about the evolution of the white society, because we hear that there are subsequent influxes of French and German settlers. How do they come about and become part of the story of the emergence of white South Africa?
This is the interesting thing. So once again, the Cape is so intriguing because the same goes for slave imports, that you never had huge numbers being imported in one go, like hundreds of people arrive at suddenly. It was always small numbers, drip and drab here and here and here. And the same goes for migration of the white population. So the one exception here is the French so-called Huguenots, the French refugees who fled France because of religious persecution. They were Protestants, and many of them ended up in places like Belgium, the Netherlands, and in England. And the VOC encouraged some of them to move to the Cape in the late 1680s. 1688 is when the bulk of them arrived. But we are talking here about 150 people to 200 people. It was a large number for that specific point in time. But once again, the VOC was always worried about potential, attention among farmers and people who would, because the VOC was very strict about its own monopoly, people who would challenge them. And so one of the things that they decided was the absolute policy is not to allow them to become a racial enclave. And they actually insisted that the French colonists would live in between Dutch families. And eventually, over time, that was successful because within about one generation, French died out as a language in the Cape because almost all of these, their children of these migrants, would marry local people. The Germans are much more interesting because, as you well know, colonialism is driven by young men, and the Cape continued to have numbers of people who would come to the Cape as employees of the VOC, and then after a few years they would apply to be freed from service, as it was called, and then they could become a free burgher. And especially in the 18th century, a large number of soldiers employed by the VOC came from the German lands because of, for instance, the religious wars there as well. And so a lot of people, families couldn't take care of all their children, and they would encourage the boys to, move elsewhere, and they would move to the Netherlands. The Netherlands was a huge market for labor because it grew so rapidly. It was the most urbanizing country in Europe. So there were lots of Germans who ended up there. Many of them went to work for the VOC. So throughout the 18th century, you had a fair number of German migrants, but they were all male. And the same thing happened here as well. When they became free burghers, they would marry the daughters of the local population. And that's how they became Dutchified. And that's why there's so little influence of German on the development of Afrikaans. And to finish this off, the figures are surprising. So people always think that the Afrikaners are largely descendants of Dutch, but the work that genealogists have done have shown that there is like 1 or 2% difference. So it's like 35% of ancestors of the Afrikaners were Dutch, and like 34 were German, and the rest are French and English and Scandinavian and so on.
Well, that is fascinating. Tongue in cheek, because both my husband and I are descendants of these German VOC employees. And there was an incident where I was visiting the Netherlands a few years ago, and I found it quite comical when a Dutch person pointed at me in conversation to another European and said, well, this is proof of the only time when Dutch managed to beat out both German and French, the fact that I was speaking Afrikaans. Mm-hmm. So it was quite funny to be part of that little nationalist moment. Mm. But what we have here is this influx of people from all around the world, and then, as slaves, as migrants, as employees, as you say. But then let's look at the continuing relations with the Khoisan population, because the part of the origin story, I suppose, is the friendly trade, which then becomes far less friendly. And the word that is used is genocide in relation in the eventual relations between the company and the Khoisan. What are your views on that?
So we kind of left behind the Khoi earlier. This question has two parts. The answer has two parts. So firstly, what's happening in the southwestern Cape? So let's call the area around Cape Town. So in the course of, as I mentioned earlier, the late 17th century, the 1680s and 90s, there's rapid expansion to the interior and what we sometimes now call the Boerland, and increasingly the colonial population would clash with the Khoi, because remember, once again, the Khois practice transhumance, so they move around. So they're not always. So at one point in the year, this white settler family arrives, and the government, the VOC, gives them a piece of land. But when they get there, there's nobody. But a few months later, the Khoi come and they say, but we always come here in spring, and what are you doing here now? So there are increasing clashes between the Khoi and the expanding colonial population, and particularly it starts flaming up in around about the year 1700 in the area what is now called Tolbach, Riebeeck West, that part of the Cape. And that's incidentally when the VOC started this system that's called a commando, where local colonial families, the men would, get on their horses and take their guns, and they would then, attack people. And this was sort of a voluntary thing, but every district had its own commando system. So this is the one. On the one hand, you have increasing expansion of the white population, which wants to practice agriculture and thereby deprive the Khoikhoi of grazing and water for their cattle. Secondly, attempts by the colonial government and people to make the Khoikhoi laborers, but they were not successful. There were some who became, cattle herds and so on, but generally they didn't want to do this. And for these reasons, increasingly what the Khoikhoi did was to start moving further north and further to the east along the south coast. The other big thing, the last little thing I want to talk about regarding the early period and the southwestern Cape, is that in 1713 there is this devastating epidemic of smallpox. So smallpox is a disease that comes from Europe. The Khoikhoi had no resistance to this, and figures differs enormously, but historians believe that as many as a quarter to a third of the local Khoikhoi population died as a result of the smallpox epidemic of 1713. And that also then encouraged even more of them to move away from the settled areas, because the pressure on them was just too big. This does not mean that the Khoikhoi disappear as a factor from this history, because, as I said earlier, the colonial population continues to spread. At first, in the early decades until about 1720s, they moved along the west coast north till where they reached what is now called Little Namakwa land, and they realized that it's too dry to go on further, and that expansion went hand in hand with a lot of clashes with the Khoikhoi. Also, because they went north and then slightly to the east into what is called the Bokkerveld and the Roggeveld and those areas. And so increasingly the Khoikhoi had to flee further and further north, but they also resisted, and sometimes the San people too with them, this expansion. And then from the middle decades, and especially in the late 18th century, the clashes continued as the colonists expanded further eastwards. Especially, first they expanded along the south coast, what was called the Swellendam district, and then they came further and further east, and then they went slightly to the inland. So what is the Kam de Boer, which is Graaf Reinet now, and there were lots of Khoikhoi groups there. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, you had this commando system, and the clashes were always about access to land and water, and there's a lot of cattle raiding from both sides. The Khoikhoi felt that we should take back some of the cattle, and then the colonists would mount a commando, and they would go and steal them, but they will steal a bit more than was taken, and you had these endless series of clashes. So to come back to the issue of genocide, this is as you know, a very controversial topic, because many people say, but the definition of genocide is a planned, systematic destruction of a group of people. And was this planned? Was this systematic? Was this a policy? Well, there is this thing about, intention and effect. The intention may not have been that we should systematically get rid of these people, but the effect was very similar. And that indeed, as we will come later, I think, talk a little bit about the Eastern Frontier. But indeed, it ends in the Khoikhoi largely disappearing as independent groups in the Greater Cape region, except for the very far north, the areas around the Orange River, and increasingly also because of the pressure on the east, some Khoisan fled into the Drakensberg mountains, which is where they would survive till the 19th century.
Use the term Khoisan strikes me as being somewhat generic. It's like one group and they don't change, and it's all the same people at the same time. As we bridge to the eastern frontier, which I'd like you to do by speaking about the Xhosas as well in this conflict from the 1770s, who are the groups and who are the heroes of the Khoisan resistance, and sort of getting a periodization? Who did Van Riebeeck meet, and who are the other people on the frontier? Who are some of the great leaders who resisted the expansion of the frontier? Do we know, or is it just a Khoisan blur?
No. The early period with Van Riebeeck, we know the names very well because Van Riebeeck kept a very careful diary, and it's very detailed. So we know the names there. We know the names of the various leaders. But further inland, they almost become synonymous because the record keeping is much more flimsy. What you would have is you have things called field cornets who were in charge of these commandos, and they would write a letter maybe to the government in the local Landros districts. There were only 4 of them by the end of the VOC period. So you had Cape Town, Stellenbosch, Swellendam, and Graaf-Reinet. And often these field cornets were, barely literate. So the documentation is very complex. And it's also not very rich. So we don't really know the names. They're often like these mysterious groups which just come in the night, Just to come back to your point about Khoisan and the term, so you have to keep in mind that Khoisan is a kind of what they call a portmanteau term. And what historians of the Khoisan groups have stressed is that it really is not a racial division, but one linked to subsistence and economy. So that Khoi could become San, which are people who make their living from the land, and they are hunter-gatherers. But sometimes San people could also become Khoi when they become pastoralists and they gather some cattle and so on. So some of the more settled Khoi groups, and of course they had various different names in the Eastern Cape, like the Hessequa and so on. Some of them, they might lose their cattle as they flee, and then they end up living more a lifestyle of hunter-gatherers in the mountains.
We speak about the move towards the eastern frontier conflict and the Fish River and how that begins. 1770 is what I hear.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, you have this continual expansion further south, because one of the things about colonial society is that it had enormous population growth. The population increased immensely in the course of the 18th century, and because of the notion that each son should have a sizable bit of land to farm on to make it profitable, you always had a large number of young men who needed to find land, and that is why it continually went further east and east. So the history of the Eastern Cape frontier is very complicated because you really need to understand the geography a little bit. So by 1760 or so, the Dutch colonists have reached the Gamtoos River, which is more or less where Knysna is, I think. At the same time, in the course of the 18th century, the Xhosa people who were more or less around the Great K River started moving further and further south. And so what happens is that by the later decades, the 1770s, 1780s, these two groups started to meet in a region which is called the Zierveld, which is basically the area east of Port Elizabeth, around the Fish River. But at the same time, the other thing which is often forgotten is that the Khoi who fled earlier from the Cape are in between these people, and they are being pushed further to the north into the mountainous areas. And once again, to come back to this earlier thing that I mentioned about a closed and open society, there's also this notion in historiography of a closed and an open frontier. For about 20 or so years, this area was what we would call an open frontier, in that there's no clear demarcation. There's also there are of course conflict, but there are also sometimes cooperation and trade going on. But as the population pressure increased, increasingly this conflict became worse and worse. And so one of the things that led to the outbreak of a war, as it's called, the First Frontier War, is in 1778 that the VOC decided that the Fish River is the border of the Cape Colony, and already the past several decades, you had several Xhosa groups that moved into the Zeerveld. It's called Zeerveld because the soil is very acidic, I believe, and that means that you can't always have your cattle graze on the land, and during certain parts of the year you needed to move to river valleys. So there was this huge competition for grazing and water in this area. And that led to the so-called first the first frontier war between the Xhosa and the colonial groups from 1779 to 1781, and it was never resolved properly. It went on for another 100 years, the various wars between these groups, and exactly which river is the border between these two groups. And it was complicated further in the 1780s and especially the 1790s, when you have the Second and the Third War, as they're called, because the Freeburgers who lived in the Graaff-Reinet district, which was only founded in the 1780s, but they became increasingly unhappy with the official policy from the VOC, from Cape Town, about trying to limit conflict, not allowing them to enslave, as I would say. They would call it inboekeling, indentering the children of the Khoisan. The VOC government was officially against this, but for these reasons, when the VOC starts to wane in its power in the 1790s, there were people in Graaff-Reinet district who actually wanted to become independent. So it was in that context of unhappiness among the Freeburgers on the one hand, in less and less influence and power from the government in Cape Town, and also then larger economic and military developments in the world, in the 1790s, which led that the situation just decreased and became worse and worse in the Eastern Cape, in this area, and that led to a whole series of wars, which, as I said, went on deep into the 19th century.
So, in a sense, you now have, one would call it, a very much a contested area, all around, from the north to the east, and then the VOC is dissolved in 1799. Why? What happened?
Yeah. Okay. So once again, that was really the result of a whole series of processes and different things coming together. So firstly, in the 17th century, the VOC was the wealthiest company in the world, without a doubt. It was immensely profitable because of the spice trade. But as more and more companies and other countries started getting involved in the Indian Ocean world, just to remind people, everybody knows about the English East India Company, but the various Scandinavian countries had it. The French had an East India Company. Even something. It didn't exist in this period, but even Belgium had its own East India Company, and so on and so forth. So in the course of the 18th century, the VOC became less and less profitable. It actually shifted its trade from moving away just from spices to other things like cloth from India, particularly. The VOC also had trading stations in the south of India. So that's, on the one hand, is decreasing profits in the course of the 18th century, linked to an ever-growing and immensely bloated bureaucracy, made worse by the fact that everything took so long. I mean, to send a letter from Batavia to the Netherlands takes a year, and an answer another year. Those of us who work on the VOC archive can tell you it is the amount of duplicates of any given document would be copied like 10 times, and it would exist the same information in 3 or 4 different archives in the world today. So it became much more bloated. There was, of course, given the size of it and the complexity of it, there's lots of opportunities for fraud and abuse, and lots of governor generals of the East Indies, got into trouble for private trade and so on. So all of these things meant that by the last quarter or so, even a bit longer, the VOC was really teetering. It actually increasingly, by the 1780s, had to loan money from the Dutch government in order to pay all its employees. The thing that really led to the fall and the rapid decline of the VOC is the so-called Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which starts in 1780. This term, I think, tends to be used in a Dutch historiography. I don't think English historians use this term, the so-called Fourth English-Dutch War. There were 3 of them in the 17th century. And that was when, if you think about your global history, the early 1780s is the American War for Independence. And the Dutch, non-officially, but in practice, supported the Americans. And for this reason, England declared war on the Netherlands in 1718. It lasts 4 years. But by this stage, unlike the 17th century, the British Navy was much stronger than the Dutch, and the Dutch suffered immense losses in terms of their navy, but also economically. And it became so bad that by the second half of the 1780s, the VOC, for instance, couldn't even get people to work for it, and they increasingly, for instance, had to use Asians as sailors on their ships that went to Europe. So basically, it was clear it was bankrupt by the 1790s, and there were all kinds of attempts by the VOC to reform it. In 1793, there was commissions sent all around the VOC world, in the Indian Ocean world, to investigate ways of trying to run it better, including at the Cape. But then what happens in the same period, once again linked to larger global history developments, is that it's the era of the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolutionary Wars, and then the Napoleonic Wars. And in 1795, the French invade the Dutch Republic. The so-called stadtholder, who is kind of the titular head of the Dutch Republic, flees to England, and you have the development of the establishment of what was called officially the Batavian Republic, this new republic under French influence. And that coincidentally is where the Dutch royal family comes from. It doesn't go back to earlier. So the Netherlands only started having kings properly, monarchs in that sense, from this period onwards. And because of, in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, the English attacks various colonial entities of the VOC, including the Cape later in 1795, and the Cape falls to the British. At the same time, not little well known, exactly at the same time, 1795, Ceylon also falls and becomes an English colony. And it was clear that the VOC couldn't continue, and the Dutch government then suggested that they take over the VOC and basically nationalizes it, and it took over its debt, and that's how the Dutch East Indies, which is now called Indonesia mostly, became a Dutch colony, a colony in the proper sense of the word, in that it is governed and administered by a national government. And that coincidentally also, Lindie, is a very intriguing fact, those of us interested in historiography, is why until very recently the Dutch refused to acknowledge its colonial links to South Africa and Ceylon, because it said that they were never part of the Dutch government. They belonged to this company, which at that point wasn't part of the Dutch government. So the government of the Netherlands had no moral interest in those parts of the world. But that's started to change now.
Well, that's very interesting, because it's been quite newsworthy in the past year or two with the formal Dutch apology for slavery. But when you look at the apology, it's really towards the Dutch West Indies.
Exactly.
And even the East Indies were not apologized to properly. And yes, as you said, absolutely no acknowledgement of the establishment of slavery in the Cape.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. It's extremely ironic to those of us who work on the Dutch Cape that until about 10, 15 years ago, as recently as that, Dutch historians, kind of completely ignored the Cape and slavery in the Indian Ocean world. I mean, the Dutch, because of this, the fact that, because we've been talking about the East, but at the same time, the Dutch also had an empire in the Caribbean world and in the northern parts of South America. And because they also became crown colonies properly in the 19th century, and there was a huge slave trade, of course, a transatlantic slave trade. So Dutch historians are focused overwhelmingly on the Atlantic slave trade and the Atlantic empire of the Dutch. And the VOC empire always lagged behind. And the only real work that started to be done by Dutch historians was literally like the past 15 or so years. Before that, all of the work that's done on Dutch trading in the Indian Ocean world was done by English or American scholars, or indeed South African scholars. It's a very ironic thing.
Speak finally about legacies and long-term impacts. What do you think? You've unsettled in many ways our understanding of the significance of 1652. You've spoken about more gradual processes. But what is the long-term impact, and how is the legacy of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, felt in South Africa in the early 21st century, if at all?
Well, I am of course biased, but I think it has an immense legacy. South Africa would not have looked the way it did had the VOC not come here in the middle of the 17th century. I always say that when I talk about my work on Afrikaans, that Afrikaans, we would not have had Afrikaans had the Portuguese or the English established a maritime station in the 17th century. But at the same time, we would not have had Afrikaans, but rather Dutch, had it not been for the fact that a slave colony developed with a huge admixture of the Khoisan population as well. And the same goes for all the other processes, economic, social, cultural, is because of the fact that the Cape was truly, and it's not a word that's often used in South African, but it was really a very Creole community. Yes, not to the same extent that you have, let's say, in Latin America with a lot of racial mixture, but certainly people lived alongside each other. But then, because of the influence of slavery, for instance, you have the development of racial prejudice. You have this development of the idea that colonists must have land and that they are not people who should do manual labor, that people of other skin colors and non-Christians, which was a huge part of their identity, that they should be the workers. So I think all of these ideas played an immense role in the 19th and 20th century. And I really think Cape historians have always been extremely hesitant to make links between the early Cape and later on, because, historians don't like to say that, we should learn lessons from history and so on. But I think it's clear that there are these lines of development that you can draw through. And even in little things like, well, it's not so little, but, the fact that you have the development of a new language, the fact that we use Roman Dutch civil law procedures still in South Africa, development of unique cultural things like, music and food and stuff that come from the Cape. It's unthinkable. South Africa as it is unthinkable without this Dutch colonial history.
Well, thank you very much for drawing those big arrows for us of the origins of South Africa. And thank you so much for your time, Gerald. Thank you.
It was a huge pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Gerald.